Hello, everybody. If everyone could get their proper hydration, we'll just raise a glass to Klaus Martins and the New York contingent that traveled so far to be here. And in the spirit of the organic movement of your great question asking and more to come. So cheers to all of you for being here. And it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Natasha Rayne, who's an assistant professor and soil fertility extension specialist, newly at UW-Madison. So we're very happy to welcome her to the stage.
All right, are y'all awake? All right, good, good. And now that you've had lunch, we can talk about poop, manure. So, all right. All right, so as said in the introduction, I'm Natasha Rayne, newly in Madison at UW-Madison. Before this, I was at UW River Falls for 9 years as a professor of soil science with an emphasis in soil fertility and nutrient management. So in that sense, I'm just continuing my work here at UW-Madison, but a little more on the extension side of things and a little heavier on the research component as well. All right, so if we're all good to move on and talk about manure, we'll dive right in, okay? As I would tell my students, let's get to work. All right, so I'm big on interaction, so if you feel like, asking a question or talking back to me, I'm fine with that, okay? In fact, I'm very uncomfortable standing in one place. I'm more of a walker. All right, so the way I have outlined this for today is basically just talk a little bit more about, or look at the history of manure and manure use, where we're at with that, and then research or review the research that has been done on the benefits of manure. I know that conceptually we all know that manure can be beneficial, but what are the benefits and what does the research show? And finally, I want to get deeper into what is a big question, is the nitrogen credits from manure. When I go out and apply manure in the fall, when are those nutrients actually available for plant uptake, right? So we'll spend some time talking about that. All right, so there's evidence that as far back as 8,000 years ago, there was already manure being used on land to supplement the native soil fertility. I'm gonna back up and say that, in my work, if you wonder about my work focuses on manure at the River Falls. I did a lot with manure and split application of nitrogen. Some other projects that I've been involved with, and actually one of them that's a big one that I brought with me to Madison is a prairie strip. Prairie strips, how many of you have heard of prairie strips? All right, so prairie strips interspersed with cropland, right? So we're looking at some of the nutritional benefits, but also what does it do for the biodiversity, right? Both underground and above ground. So that's some of the work that I've been involved with. So if you want to talk to me about that, whenever the opportunity comes, please do. All right, so farmers early on realized that there were benefits to growing plants where animals had grazed or gathered, right? So they realized very early on that there was a benefit to manure. All right, so cropping then developed at the same time or the same rate as herding historically. What we also found is that early reports from the USDA showed that it was believed that if you neglected livestock manure, you had it on your farm, but you neglected it, it might actually cause losses for your farm, economically speaking. All right, I like this quote, and I mean, I can spend I can spend a couple of minutes just unpacking this because I'm wired that way to just unpack stuff. But I like this quote from Snyder at Iowa State College, who said, "One of the important functions of farm manure is to convey back to the soil in a readily available form the majority of plant food removed from it by crops." And I love this because I can just dive right into the availability, right? Because that's the big thing, okay? We have all those nutrients packed in this manure mass, but how much of it is really, really available, okay? So the concern was that much of the crop was leaving the farm, right? It was leaving the farm with all the nutrients in it, right? So you remove the crop, you harvest the crop, you harvest that biomass. Now you're removing from the farm them nutrients, right? Those nutrients, and that it would not return back to the soil. So manure was seen as a way to return in an organic form those nutrients back to the farm. So when we think about, when we look at the global use of manure and nitrogen, I like this chart because what it shows us is a couple of things, right? So the cream colored at the bottom, that is our synthetic fertilizer, nitrogen coming from synthetic fertilizer. The green right here represents nitrogen in manure that is just deposited on paddocks and whatnot, right? And then at the top, this brown represents manure that has actually been stored or processed and returned back to the land, so applied, right? So those are the three components that we see here. And these numbers are kind of just to give us an idea that totally, if you look at this graph, right, there's roughly 225 million tons of nitrogen input into agricultural soils. Okay, I'll pause a little. You with me? All right. Yeah, I'm like that, sorry. All right, so and then 75% of livestock manure that is left on permanent meadows or pastures, right? So 75% of the nitrogen is left as manure on pastures, okay? And then 25%, that's the brown part here, right, is treated and then returned to agricultural land, right, to cropland or whatnot. All right, so once we understand that, and this is where I maybe need to pause a little, about 1/3 of all the manure that is either deposited, right, in paddocks and pastures, right, and what has been applied as fertilizer was lost to leaching. 1/3. 1/3. All right. So livestock manure inputs were 75% greater in 2017 in comparison to 1961. So this chart starts at 1961, and clearly we see a growth of nitrogen inputs over time, both synthetic fertilizer and manure. But I really want you to think about this 1/3, right, of nitrogen that we put into the soil, or think that we put into the soil, is lost through leaching. That's significant. So, you know, manure is one of those things where we can come at this at different angles, right? We can talk about manure nitrogen in the environment, which is not my take today. Today, I just want to focus on the benefits, right? Okay? Because we could spend a whole lot of time just talking about the nitrogen that ends up in the environment. All right, so if we look at global use of nitrogen through manure, right? So this is nitrogen that is in manure. This is work that I did with a colleague, just looking at data, right? What is out there in terms of data. And what came out on top is that most of the nitrogen in manure that is put back into the soil is in the form of poultry manure, okay? All sorts of poultry, not just chicken. And that makes sense. That was surprising at first, but when you think of it, when you look at the nitrogen values or the nitrogen content in poultry manure is pretty high, right? Especially if you compare it to dairy manure, beef, et cetera, et cetera. So no surprises here. Sorry for the metric units, but you know, this was an international publication or international work, right? So we use international units or metric units, but the message is clear, right? So most of the nitrogen input from manure came from poultry manure. So what about the US? We see pretty much the same thing, right? Most of the nitrogen, which was surprising to me being in Wisconsin, right? Right, I was looking at this from a Wisconsin kind of perspective and going, wow, poultry manure. So most of the nitrogen that we find applied to land is in the form of poultry manure. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the benefits. As I said, I don't think this is necessarily new information, but it was important for me to kind of just put things in perspective, line them all up, like, okay, what do we know in terms of all these benefits that manure offers to soil? So I looked at a couple of things like crop growth and yield and soil chemical properties, biological properties, physical properties. And so when we look at yield, this is work that was done by Schlegel et al. And they looked at cattle manure, swine manure, and then synthetic or commercial nitrogen, right? And then they looked at yields. And so when you look at the yields here, and I have to put my readers on, sorry. So when you look at the yields here, clearly cattle manure outperformed swine manure. Let's look at that last column. That's what I'm focusing on. And certainly outperformed synthetic nitrogen, right? So we see higher values for the cattle manure. But what I want to draw your attention to is that when cattle manure was applied in twice the amount of nitrogen that was needed, so what they looked at is how much nitrogen is needed in the soil. Okay, well, let's apply cattle manure based on the nitrogen need in the soil. Okay, and then they doubled the amount, okay? And when they did that, didn't make a difference. So the question is, right, so if the nitrogen didn't make a difference for yield, where is it? Right, so where is it? So what this study did, and let me just explain that a little better. So you see cattle phosphorus, cattle nitrogen, what does all that mean? So in one case, they applied cattle manure based on the phosphorus need. In another instance, they applied it based on the nitrogen need, and so on and so forth. They did the same with swine, as you can see there. But clearly, so cattle manure outperformed the rest, but the message here is if I double the amount of nitrogen through manure application, in one instance we even see a numerical drop. Do you see that? Y'all need to talk back to me. All right. Okay, so is that clear? All right. So what do we learn then? Again, you know, I wish I could show all the data that's out there, but if we summarize all this, what are some of the conclusions, if you will? So most studies that we looked at, manure application improved grain yield over no fertilization. I guess that's a no-brainer most of the time. Application based on nitrogen. So if I go out and apply manure based on the nitrogen need, oftentimes leads to a phosphorus over application. Now you have excess phosphorus in your soil. How many of you knew that? Right, excess phosphorus in your soil, and I'll explain it a little bit. So manure characteristics and climatic conditions dictate crop response to manure. No surprises there. We will talk a little bit more about climatic conditions because that is exactly what part of my work here at Madison. In some studies, however, no yield differences were found between manure treatments and the control. Why is that? What was the conclusion here? Well, the conclusion is manure is a slow release kind of source of nutrients, right? So, and that's exactly the question that my research program will tackle. Like, okay, well, if it's a slow release source of nutrients, when does it become available? Can we predict that? Can we put together this fancy model that has weather variables, soil variables, and whatnot to kind of predict when that nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium or other nutrients become available? Now, returning back to that second point, application based on nitrogen leads to phosphorus over application. Just to give you a simple example of that. So if I have different manure types, as you can see in this table here, all right? And I send them to the lab and they come back and this is the analysis for it. Oh, ma'am, in your dairy manure, you have 5 pounds of phosphorus per ton or 10 pounds of nitrogen per ton, etc. So this is the analysis. If I have a 180 bushel corn crop, it removes on average based on the nitrogen content and the phosphorus content, it removes roughly 142 pounds of nitrogen, okay, and 27 pounds of phosphorus. Great. My analysis said my dairy manure provides 10 pounds of nitrogen per ton. So if I do the math, right, so 10 pounds of nitrogen per ton, I need 142 pounds of nitrogen. That is roughly 142 divided by 10, call it 14 tons of dairy manure, okay? So we need 14 tons of dairy manure. Now, 14 tons of manure, however, this is the problem. 14 tons of manure provides 14 times 5 is 70 pounds of phosphorus. I only needed 27. Are y'all seeing this? Okay, somebody help me with the math. That's how many extra pounds of phosphorus did I have? 70 minus 27. Thank you. 43. Thank you. 43 pounds of extra phosphorus, right? So we have a problem there, right? Because especially if you're on soils that are prone to erosion, I don't have to tell you, right? So that phosphorus ends up in places where we don't want it, okay? So that's a problem. Excuse me. All right. So let's look at some chemical properties then. This is a study that a student of mine did, a simple study where we looked at 2 different rates of manure, 30, 60 tons, right? And then they'd apply urea. We applied urea as 150 pounds of N per acre. and then combined 30 tons of manure with 150 pounds of N per acre in the form of urea. For organic matter, this was, I must say, this was just, 2 years of data or 1 year of data here, represented here. We don't see a statistical difference in organic matter. There was no difference. I mean, the numbers were all over the place. No statistical difference. The same can be said about pH, even though we did kind of see a trend, but we can't call this a real difference, right? So if you see the pH go from 6.1 to 6.3, right? So statistically, we couldn't say with confidence that this was a real difference. When we look at the phosphorus and the potassium, however, that is where things get interesting, because you can see that the 30 tons and the 60 tons of manure applied clearly, let's look at the phosphorus first, right, clearly increased the amount of phosphorus in the soil, right? Clearly increased the amount of phosphorus. Now, what is interesting is when we look at the nitrogen. What's causing this? It's less than my control where I applied nothing. What's happening there? What is the crop doing? It's starving for nutrients. It's mining that soil, right? So now you're sitting at below the level you started out with. Y'all are with me still? We're good? Not sure? All right, that's fine. We'll get through this. Hang with me for a minute. All right, so that is an interesting finding. And if it was phosphorus alone, but we see the same trend when we look at that other column, the potassium is doing the same thing. Right? So clearly, the synthetic fertilizer, in this case, had a negative impact on the nutrients in the soil, in that it was starving for the other nutrients and basically mining the soil for them precious nutrients. Okay? Now, when we look at organic matter, this was a study done by Butler et al. And what we see here, I'm just going to be short on this, but clearly you apply manure, right, and the numbers for organic matter go up with an increased rate of manure, or in this case, dairy compost that was applied. So when looking at some of these numbers that were offered in literature, I expected that we would see an extreme increase or a significant increase in the carbon content in the soil as a function of manure. Not so. Which surprised me, because when we look at the relationship, so we looked at different studies, we compiled the data, right? And we looked at manure rate as a function, or the soil organic carbon as a function of manure rate. There was really no relationship. Now, granted, and I want to make this argument, if we had looked at primarily, and this is just my thought, we can discuss this later, if we had looked at primarily long-term data, long-term manure studies, right, perhaps we would have seen a stronger relationship. But the conclusion here is that the addition of manure doesn't necessarily increase the amount of carbon, soil organic carbon in this case. What it does is that it helps to maintain the carbon where it's at, right? The argument is made that inorganic fertilizer, so synthetic fertilizer, causes a drop in carbon, whereas manure application helps to maintain that carbon where it's at. So, in my assessment, it was kind of disappointing, but I made the argument and discussed this and was like, maybe if we had sifted data and only looked at long-term trials, we might have seen more of a significant relationship. And I want to read what Marshner and Noble said. So increased microbial respiration It's because of the addition of organic matter is the source of the decrease in soil organic carbon. So increased microbial respiration because of the addition of organic matter is the source of the decrease in soil organic carbon. So what he's saying is that when you're applying manure, the microbes become more active. And what they're doing in becoming more active is that they respire, right? They let go of CO2, carbon dioxide. And it's because of the increase in carbon dioxide that goes into the atmosphere, now you can't really see an increase in carbon in the soil. Is that registering? I'll say that again. So if the microbes become more active, they respire more, right? They let go of CO2, carbon dioxide. And that is what's causing that gradual decrease in carbon in the soil. All right? You with me still? All right. I told you we were going to work. All right, so if we look at soil physical properties then, a number of things, and I'm just going to present some graph and explain them. But this particular study by Selig et al. Looked at two different depths of soil. And what they looked at is basically the porosity in the soil. Can somebody tell me why porosity is something important in soil? Why was that? Holding on to water. What else can we think of? Air circulation, gases in the soil, right? So all that is important. And what this study looked at, so they had a control, they had an NPK fertilizer, they had compost, cattle manure, and then mycorrhizal inoculated compost. And what you're seeing there is, if we start with the 0 to 6 inches and look at the 6 to 12 inches as well, we see that compost and cattle manure had the overall total porosity. In other words, these sources, these organic sources, contributed to the total porosity quite significantly. So they helped make the soil more porous, okay? So that, again, is good for air circulation, it's good for the microbes in the soil, it's good for your water holding capacity, and so on and so forth. Now, this particular study also looked at a couple of parameters, soil physical properties, such as that first one is bulk density. Bulk density is basically a measure of compaction. It looked at the hydraulic conductivity, which is nothing more than just the ease with which water flows through the soil. They looked at organic matter. And then they looked at mean weight diameter of aggregates in soil. Aggregates in soil. Aggregates speaks to soil structure, right? And if we look at the numbers, so they looked at three rates of manure, right? And for bulk density, they sampled within the row and then outside of the row or in between rows. What we see is clearly a drop in bulk density, okay? We see a drop in bulk density, which is good. It tells us there's less compaction happening as you increase your manure rates. Hydraulic conductivity, meaning the ease with which water flows through the soil, we see a numerical increase, but it's not statistically different, okay? They're not calling this a difference. And then organic matter, just as we expected, we see an increase in the organic matter numbers. And the diameter of aggregates, we also see an increase, meaning that the aggregates got bigger, okay? Which tells us there's good soil structure. All right, so this is from data, again, that we summarized and looked at in literature overall. And this is what we kind of expected, that as you increase your manure rate, that the bulk density should come down, right? It's less compact. So no surprises there. So overall, what can we say about physical properties then? So manure helps to lower the soil bulk density. It increases soil pores to support growth of crop roots. Increased infiltration rate is accomplished, and increased water holding capacity. And depending on the time, rate, and properties of the manure applied, soil temperature, because that's another variable that we looked at, soil temperature, manure application, and how it affected soil temperature, and those numbers were all over the place. There wasn't a consistent trend that we saw. So the temperature could either go up or down. I couldn't resist to show this, it looks like I'm standing still, but I'm really jumping on the inside because, this is so awesome, right? And a friend of mine, a friend I just met was like, this is what I like, worms, right? Okay, all right. So let's talk a little about biology then. So we did a study, this was in 2018. A student of mine looked at CO2 burst, and CO2 burst is basically just saying CO2 escaped from the soil as a function of the life in it, right? And we looked at a couple of things. We collected samples after manure application and before planting. That's the red bars. Right? And then we came later in the season prior to harvest, like a couple of days before harvest, and we went back in and collected CO2 samples again. And there's a couple of interesting things that we see here. First of all, with the control where there was nothing applied, we see a drop, right? So that's here, a drop in the CO2. Okay, no surprise there because you didn't add any amendment to the soil, so really nothing happened. But when we look at inorganic fertilizer, way at the end here in the form of urea, it's also interesting to see a drop in the biology in the soil. Interesting, isn't it? Now, what I expected to find, or what was kind of disappointed, was with the manure, right? We also, in the case of, this was 30 tons per acre, 30, 60. So we didn't see much of a difference here with the higher rates. So yeah, so that was surprising. The argument was maybe if we had collected samples earlier in the season, we would have seen something there. So there being no difference here was kind of surprising. And there being a drop in the microbial activity or CO2 burst was also surprising for that 30 tons per acre. But again, I want to make the argument, had we maybe collected samples earlier in the season or later, maybe would have seen something different there. But it is what it is. But I think that we're learning something here, especially with the synthetic fertilizer. There is no biological benefit to it. So continuing this talk on microbial biomass, right? Phospholipid fatty acid, that's PLFA, that you see there. So this study had a control. Then they applied ammonium nitrate, so a synthetic fertilizer, a low rate of manure and a high rate of manure. And a couple of things that we're seeing here is that gradually you can see an increase, right? You can see an increase in microbial biomass if you go from control to, there was no statistical difference here, but if you go from control to manure here, to a higher rate of manure, you can clearly see a difference. The other thing that is interesting to see is that if you increase the soil depth, and I think that we conceptually know that microbial biomass is decreasing, right? As you go deeper in the soil, there's less and less microbial activity. So back to work that I did, looking at different sources of manure globally, and then looking at the bacteria and fungi that came from it. It is interesting to note that sometimes we saw no difference at all between 0 and when you applied cattle manure, right? Almost the same number there, right? But other times you clearly saw a difference in microbial, in bacteria in the soil, so they increased if you applied manure. But I think that what was interesting is when we dove deeper into the data and tried to decipher, okay, what bacteria are we talking about? And that is where you see a couple of things happening, right? Okay, so the first number here represents the initial situation, and the second number represents after manure application. In some cases, you see some groups, so this represents different groups of bacteria, okay? So we looked at, okay, the difference between bacteria and fungi, but then within bacteria, we looked at what type of bacteria are we talking about, okay? And then you see some groups increasing and some groups decreasing as a function of manure application. So what do we learn? What did we learn from all these data? Well, first of all, we see an increase in microbial population for most of the studies. We see an improved fungal and bacterial diversity. So not only the number increased, but the diversity. So there were more type of microbes present. That making sense? So that's diversity. We saw also that activities or processes related to these groups of organisms increase, such as mineralization, colonization of plant roots, soil aggregation with the help of fungal hyphae, and so on. So that's clear, I hope. So let's jump into looking at manure credits, nitrogen credits. So in manure, we have two types of nitrogen, right? We have organic nitrogen, and then we have inorganic nitrogen. Inorganic nitrogen is nitrogen that is just available, readily available. The problem is with the organic nitrogen, because the organic nitrogen has to be broken down before it can become available. The fancy word for it is mineralization, right? So the inorganic form of nitrogen is primarily present as ammonium. And the problem is with ammonium, it can become ammonia. And ammonia is a gas. So you lose it, right? You lose it to the atmosphere. Now, this loss of ammonia is a function of different factors, and I will list two here: the type of manure and the time of incorporation. But I would argue that there's a lot more factors, like weather conditions. That's a big one. So why should we care? Well, we should care about, we're hoping that whenever we're applying a source of nutrients, that them nutrients end up in the crop. Isn't that the truth? Is that right? Yes, we hope that they will end up in the crop. So what you're seeing here is a study that I did with different sources of manure, of organic amendments, and some digestate as well, right? And what we saw here is that the digestate treatment 5 applied at a single rate of nitrogen had the highest nitrogen recovery. So this is why we care, right? Because we want that we want to see that nitrogen in the crop. All right. So another study that I did with a student of mine looked at, manure and inorganic nitrogen. And it was interesting to see a couple of things, right? When we looked at the manure, the 30 and the 60 tons, and we looked at nitrate in the soil, we didn't find very high rates or very high presence of nitrate, especially when we compared that to urea that we applied here, where there was much more of that nitrogen available in the form of nitrate. And then that last one where we applied a combination of them too, manure and urea, right? So what's happening here in this last case here is that because you're providing extra nitrogen in the form of urea, those microbes go wild, right? So they break down whatever organic nitrogen they have there, and they release it into the soil. So no surprises here, right? No surprises here. But the question I had here, so where's the nitrogen? Where is this nitrogen? I applied so much manure. I expected to see it. It's not there. Not there yet, right? And just like the other study, had we gone out and maybe waited a couple of months and sampled that same soil, we might have seen the final release of that nitrogen, but we did not do that. All right, so with the nutrient application guidelines that we use in Wisconsin, so this is a publication for the nutrient application guidelines for field vegetable and fruit crops. We work with numbers that have been produced over the years with all the research that has been done. And what they present here in this particular graph is just the percentage of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and sulfur that you can expect from the manure or to be available from the manure in your first year after application, second year, and third year after application. So that's what we're looking at here, your first year availability of nutrients in percentage, okay? Second year availability, and then third year availability. Okay, now let's use an example. If I have solid dairy manure, I'm applying it, and I'm incorporating it before 3 days. So I spread it out and I incorporate it between 1 to 72 hours. Then I can expect 30% of the nitrogen to be available. Okay, so don't forget that 30%. This is just a list of different manure types and their nutrient content. Again, this is just based on data that they got in the lab. They analyzed soil samples, and they put the averages on paper, okay? So again, when we look at dairy solid, they're saying that we have 9 pounds of nitrogen per ton, okay? So that's this number. So in a little example, let's see how we would calculate nitrogen availability each year. So here's the example. I have solid dairy manure. I'm applying it at 20 tons per acre. I incorporate it 24 hours later. This is just an example. And I send the sample into the lab, and it came back at 9 pounds of nitrogen per ton. Ma'am, you have 9 pounds of nitrogen per ton of manure. Okay, great. Let's go to work. How much can I expect that first year? Well, that first year, it's the 30% that we saw, times the 9, times the amount I'm applying. Okay, so are y'all still with me? I lost y'all. All right, okay, so that's my first year. My second year, right, my second year was 10%. Okay, that's what the graph said, or the table. 10% times the 9 times the 20 is 18 pounds. Okay, and so on and so forth. This is third year, and so on. Okay, so if you're really critically looking at this, you're going, oh, that's nice, but what if I have a very dry year? Does this still apply? If I have a very wet year, does this still apply? And that's the question, right, before us today. So do we need to look a little deeper at the data, right? So, and that's a challenge for my program. All right, but if you have continuous manure application year after year after year, not only, right, so let's say in year 2, you're doing a new application of manure. Now, all of a sudden, not only do you have second year credit, but you also need to account for that first year of the new application. You see what I'm saying? So that's what's going on here. Just wanted to remind us that if you're doing year after year after year manure application, you need to account for the previous year as well. All right, I'm going to hasten through this. This is a study done by Matafelli, and what he found is that the nitrogen availability coming from manure. This was liquid injected dairy manure, right? Ranged anywhere from 12 to 63. Now that is quite a variability, right? So again, right, so I'm laying down here a challenge in front of us to think deeper about these book values or cookie cutter recommendations we get sometimes. And I say that only because, you know, that's the challenge that my program will be dealing with in the next few years. And probably I will be on this until retirement. So that is the challenge before us. All right, timing has a great impact on nutrient availability, nitrogen availability. The take home from this slide is that when we fall applied manure versus spring application, so the blue representing fall, what's that called? Orange representing the spring application. We see that nitrate loss, the loss of nitrogen in the form of nitrate, was a lot higher when I fall applied manure. Well, that kind of makes sense because I'm farther away from the planting window, from actually planting a crop or growing a crop in the field. So there is more potential for nitrate loss. So that is the takeaway from this. So timing has everything to do with it. This is another study that looked at timing, early fall application, late fall, and spring applied manure. And we see that a nitrogen stabilizer was added to it in one case, and the nitrogen stabilizer was left out of it. I want you to look at the trend of the numbers, right? With spring application, more of the nitrogen was actually available. That's what it's saying here, right? Same here, right? And not in this case, but you get the general idea. All right, so the question is, should we consider other factors? This particular study, guys, looked at things like the CN ratio, the carbon to nitrogen ratio, right? And the higher the carbon to nitrogen ratio you had, the more potential you had that nitrogen got tied up by the microbes. That's why you see negative numbers here, okay? So that is the take home here. So what do we get from this particular study? They said that 60 to 75% of nitrogen in feather meal and guano are typically available within 100 days. By the way, this was just not a field study. This was done as an incubation study in the lab. 30 to 40% of nitrogen are available from poultry manure and compost after 100 days. Less than 10% of vermicompost and yard waste was actually available after 100 days. Again, why was this? It was because of the higher CN ratios that you see here. So they had more carbon and less nitrogen in it to begin with. Okay. All right, promise that I'll wrap this up soon here. So challenges, right? The challenge is, people, we saw some variability. We have high variability in the nutrient content. And we haven't even begun to really explore all the different types and sources of manure yet, right? But I present these numbers to you to look at, to say, hey, we have a lot of variability. And the variability is coming from things like storage. How was the manure stored? Bedding material. How is it managed? Et cetera, et cetera. This particular study, and I'm not going to go deep in it, but what they found is nitrogen availability of cattle manure was lower than pig or chicken manure. And this was mainly attributed to differences in diet. See how much we have to consider and how much thinking we have to do, and the CN ratio. This is work out of the U of M extension. We love them. So what you see here is that what they considered is here on top. They considered all these different methods of application. They went that far. You see what I'm saying? You see how much work we have to do still. So much that we lack in understanding and so much that we can do better. And then what about cover crops? Do cover crops impact plant available nitrogen? By the time I'm ready to actually grow my cash crop, is there any nitrogen available still? And this is a slide. I'm grateful for Matt Ruark's lab, which I borrowed this slide from. But what it basically shows us, though, they collected fall soil samples and spring samples. And clearly, by the time you're in spring, you have way less available nitrogen in the soil to different depths. All right, so in ending, what is our take home? Well, there's many benefits to adding manure to the soil. We saw that. However, the actual availability of nutrients, and especially nitrogen, because that's what I focused on, is highly variable. And it depends on a number of factors, right? Manure type, timing, method of application, weather, soil type, cover crop, etc., etc. So much more work, and I advocate for this, is needed in location-specific and cropping system-specific, management-specific management or understanding of nutrients in manure, right? Meaning that we have to do more with the data. Look at weather variables, look at soil variables, look at the whole thing from beginning to end, and then draw our conclusion, because as I said, a cookie cutter approach, I don't know. We can only go so far with it, right? But we have to deepen our understanding of the nutrients in manure, and that's what I will work on. Finally, this is my contact information, and with that, thank you, and I want to open it up for discussion, please.
I love to talk about poop. All right. We're talking about nutrient values, and we deep pit hog manure is our primary source of nitrogen for our organic operation, or nutrients in general. It seems like with my manure management plan, the company that sets up the MMP and they do the manure analysis, they come take the samples and everything. And the pig owners want us to move the manure as fast as we can, get the barns drained down as fast as we can, so we run into agitation issues and all sorts of different issues with that I'm trying to deal with. But the other thing I'm noticing is, like say on a 6,600 head site where we've got 6 different pits we're pulling manure out of, it seems like they're using the sample that gives us the lowest manure value, nitrogen value, and phosphorus value, so they can push the rate as hard as they can on the acres to try to get as many gallons on the least amount of acres to get it spread out as fast as we can. And so I'm constantly battling with this. Have you worked with any of this equipment that can actually sample manure as it's going through my umbilical hose as I'm injecting it? I mean, are these things accurate? And
right.
What are my options? I would love to do more sampling of the manure on my own just to see what these rates are actually at, where I need to be.
Yeah, thank you for that question. No, I have not been involved with that work yet, but that's only because I've been here 4 weeks. But yes, there are initial conversations to be involved with that work. Where are they at with testing that? I am not sure. I'm not sure where they're at, but I'll make sure that we run it right.
Are you doing any work on how low a rate of manure can be applied to get the soil biological benefits? Or is anybody else doing that kind of work?
Great question. So no, I'm not involved with the biological side of things, right? And you're talking about what is the minimum amount that will have those microbes go, right? Yeah, so my comment on that would be that it all depends on, and it will depend again on what we saw with the carbon to nitrogen ratio, right? Because the truth is that the more carbon you're applying, the less those microbes love that environment. They don't like that environment. A lot of carbon. They need a lot of nitrogen. So it's going to depend on that carbon to nitrogen ratio, among others. But yeah, to answer your question specifically, what rate, that is hard to say, really. It's not only a function of rate, it's also going to be a function of carbon to nitrogen ratio, the composition of that manure, right? How much organic matter is in that manure to begin with, what bedding material, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah.
So on the one study I saw on the slide, it was 4 of 6 years when the manure is applied, fall versus spring, right? So did they have any comments in that study at what they attributed those 2 years to, that where it was basically the same? Was it just a weather difference, or what? I'm just curious if we know what's going on.
Exactly. So this goes back to my point about how important weather is, right? That we don't have the same weather from year to year. We don't have the same environment. So if you ask me, yes, completely. Do I know if it was specifically a drought issue or was it too wet? But my guess is that this is a function of the weather. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah.
So from what I've seen, and including with some UW research, is
Yeah.
that there are long legacy effects of manure. So it's not necessarily just nitrogen
No.
that can benefit the crops, but I think I've seen some studies at UW that even like 25, 50 years after manure applications, you can still see some differences, and they're beneficial differences.
Yeah.
Can you speak at all to the legacy effects of manure and what's driving those legacy effects?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of I think I showed a slide about the phosphorus and the potassium, especially, not so much with the nitrogen, but it's mostly those nutrients that are not as volatile as nitrogen, where we see more of a legacy effect years later, right? But with nitrogen, however, I feel that we always will have those dynamics where we have to apply fresh nitrogen in some form. The other thing that I want to say, and I said that in my when I showed the slide on carbon, I also still believe that there's a carbon benefit to adding manure. Absolutely, right? So on the long term. So if you ask me, it's the carbon and primarily the immobile nutrients that we really see a benefit to years later. Yeah.
Calculations really helpful that you provided.
Oh, thank you.
All right, let's give Dr. Rayne a